Imagine losing everything you ever worked for. Your home, your family, your dignity, all because of one signature you never wrote. Imagine walking into a grocery store, not for sympathy, not to beg, just to buy a loaf of bread, and being treated like trash, laughed at, yelled at, humiliated, in front of strangers who didn't know your story. But one person did, and that person was the reason you lost it all. This is the story of Samuel Thompson, and the truth that came back with $5 and a broken heart. The city hadn't seen rain in days, but that morning, the clouds returned like an old ache, the kind you don't talk about but feel in your bones. Samuel Thompson stood across the street from Fresh Mart, staring at the entrance like it was something sacred or dangerous. In his palm, $5, creased damp but real, the last of what little he had scraped together after collecting cans. Fixing a broken gate for an old man who paid him in coins and stale coffee, and a quiet blessing from a kind soul who left a folded bill in his paper cup without saying a word. Today wasn't about survival. It was about reclaiming something small, something human. Bread. Just bread. He checked his reflection in the glass of a parked car. His coat was fraying at the seams. His shoes had holes beneath the soles. And his beard, salted by hardship and age, framed a face once proud, now weathered by time and the streets. But his eyes, they still held something. No shame, not quite hope either, but something harder to name. He took a breath and stepped inside. The store felt colder than usual, too clean, too bright. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the scent of disinfectant mingled with fresh produce and bleach. A woman wrangled her toddlers near the cereal aisle. A man in a suit was mumbling into a Bluetooth headset while tossing energy drinks into his cart. No one looked at Samuel. Or rather, they looked and then looked away. Except one, Carl Winford, the owner. Carl stood behind the customer service desk, a clipboard in one hand and judgment in his eyes. He narrowed them the second Samuel stepped past the automatic doors. The moment said everything. Carl didn't need to say a word, but of course, he did. "What do you want?" he barked, loud enough for heads to turn. Samuel's voice was low, steady. "Bread." Carl's lip curled. "We don't hand out charity." "I'm not asking for charity," Samuel replied softly. He unfolded the bill in his hand, smoothing it out. "I've got money." Carl took a step forward, snatched the bill from him, and held it between two fingers like it was contaminated. "This isn't a soup kitchen," he said, venom rising in his tone. "We serve paying customers." Samuel stood still. "I am a paying customer." Carl scoffed. "You're a beggar in a coat that smells like last month's garbage. And if you don't get out of my store in the next 5 seconds, I'm calling the police." The store fell silent. The man with the Bluetooth stopped speaking. The toddler stopped crying. Even the beeping at the register seemed to pause, just for a breath. And then, a voice, small but firm. "That's not right." It came from an older woman near the oranges. Her hair was white, her glasses smudged, but her voice? Steady as steel. "I've seen this man before," she continued. "He helped old Mr. Gentry last month when his cart rolled into traffic. Risked getting hit to save a man he didn't even know." Another voice chimed in. A boy, maybe 17, wearing a school uniform. "He helped me, too. I lost my bus card, and he gave me his last $2 so I could get home." Samuel looked stunned. He hadn't expected kindness. Not anymore, and especially not in here. Carl shifted uncomfortably. His grip on the $5 bill tightened. "He's probably here to steal," Carl snapped. "You don't know what men like that are capable of." "Men like what?" The old woman shot back. "Men who've been failed by the world? Men who still show up with their heads." "Hi." But Samuel had already begun to turn toward the exit, not because he was ashamed, because this wasn't new. He'd learned to walk away when the world stopped seeing him. What he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was the pale face of the man frozen in the bread aisle. Brian, the assistant manager. His eyes weren't on Samuel. They were on Carl. And in that brief, flickering moment, a secret passed between them. A secret years old. A secret that would change everything. Brian Miller stood completely still, a loaf of wheat bread dangling forgotten in his hand. From where he stood, just behind the corner shelving, he had a perfect view of the confrontation. He watched Carl berate Samuel, his voice echoing like a gavel cracking down on judgment. The customers' gasps, the brief murmur of protest from the old woman, the stunned expression on the boy's face. It all blurred around him. Brian wasn't watching the crowd. He was watching Carl, his boss, his mentor, his mistake. The moment Samuel walked in, something inside Brian shifted. A sense of dread crawled up the back of his neck and took root in his chest like a vine. He recognized the man instantly, even after all these years. Not just the face, but the posture, the calm way he stood under pressure, the haunted look in his eyes. Samuel Thompson, the man who had once looked at him with complete trust, the man he had helped destroy. Brian placed a loaf of bread back on the shelf with trembling fingers and quietly walked to the back of the store. He needed air, but not the kind that came from outside. He needed distance from the man he had wronged. Inside the storage room, Brian leaned against the metal shelves, his breath ragged, guilt pressing down like an avalanche. He opened his phone, scrolled to the very bottom of his gallery, and there it was, a photo, grainy, cropped, a scanned delivery slip from 6 years ago, a signature, his, not Samuel's. He had buried that file deep, just like he had buried the truth. He told himself it was a mistake, that he'd been pressured, that Carl had said it was standard protocol, just paperwork. But he had known. He had known when Samuel came to the office looking confused, holding the delivery manifest in his hand. He had known when Carl slammed the door shut behind him and said, "We'll handle it." He had known when Samuel lost everything. Brian sat down on a crate, rubbing his hands. Brian sat down on a crate, rubbing his hands over his face. They were sweating, shaking. He had never come forward, never spoken up, never admitted what he'd done, not even to himself. He had stayed silent while Samuel was fired from Vanguard Courier Services. He had stayed silent when the police arrived. He had stayed silent when Carl made sure Samuel would never work in the industry again. And now that man, still breathing, still walking, still human, had shown up at Freshmart with $5 and a quiet dignity that made Brian's chest ache. Outside, the store returned to motion. The spell had broken. People moved again, whispered. Some cast backward glances at the door Samuel had walked through. Jalen, the boy in the school uniform, followed him outside. "Hey, sir," he called, jogging up behind him. "Are you okay?" Samuel didn't answer at first. He kept walking toward the bench near the bus stop, shoes flapping faintly with every step. Jalen hesitated, then sat beside him without asking. "You helped me once," the boy said softly. "You probably don't remember." Samuel gave him a tired smile. "I remember more than people think." Jalen reached into his backpack and pulled out a granola bar. "I know it's not bread, but..." Samuel chuckled quietly. "I'm not hungry, just tired." Jalen nodded. "Tired of what?" Samuel turned and looked him in the eye. His voice was soft but solid. Of being invisible. Back in the office, Carl stormed in, slamming the drawer shut as he stuffed Samuel's $5 bill inside without counting the till. Brian sat in the corner, quiet. "You see what happens when you let people like that in here?" Carl muttered. Brian didn't answer. Carl turned. "You got something to say?" Brian looked up. Not yet, but something inside him was changing. Not just guilt, conviction. He took his phone from his pocket and stared again at the forged document, the one with his name where Samuel should have been. The past was knocking. And this time, Brian might just open the door. Samuel stared at the streetlight across from the bench where he now sat, his back aching against the worn wood, his hands resting quietly in his lap. Jalen had gone, leaving the granola bar beside him as a quiet offering. He hadn't touched it. The clouds were beginning to break. A single ray of late sunlight pierced through, warming the corner of the bench. Samuel shifted to feel it on his face. It reminded him, just briefly, of the days before everything collapsed. 6 years ago, before the fall. Back then, Samuel lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment on Linden Street with his wife, Diane, and their teenage son, Carter. His days began with a strong cup of coffee and a quiet ride to work in a company van. His job with Vanguard Courier Services wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, honest work. He was trusted with sensitive deliveries, government documents, medical pharmaceuticals, even high-security parcels for private companies. Not once did he arrive late. Not once did he mishandle a package. His records were spotless. His colleagues called him the anchor. One Monday morning, he arrived to find Carl Winford, the then regional logistics manager, waiting in the warehouse office. Carl smiled too much, asked too few questions, and carried an aura of entitlement Samuel had learned to read as danger. Samuel looked over the papers. "This doesn't match the schedule I got on Friday." Carl waved it off. Just paperwork shuffle, quick in and out. Samuel hesitated, but signed. That detour changed his life. 2 days later, Carl summoned him back to the office. A shipment of restricted pharmaceuticals had gone missing. Security logs were corrupted. GPS data was inconclusive. And the signature authorizing delivery? Samuel's name was on it, but not his handwriting. He knew it. Carl knew it. And still, Samuel was told to wait at home pending investigation. By the following week, he was terminated, his severance revoked, his name whispered around town like a ghost. He applied everywhere, every delivery company, warehouse, even a city janitorial position. Every door slammed. He cashed out his 401k to keep their apartment another month. Diane tried to find more hours at her nursing job. Carter stayed after school to avoid the stress at home. But money is a fire, and there's burn fast. When their landlord finally taped the eviction notice to the door, Samuel didn't rage. He simply sat, back to the present. That moment, more than any other, haunted him. Not the anger, not the humiliation, but the silence. No lawyer, no union, no media outrage. He was invisible, branded by a lie he couldn't disprove, because a man who forged his signature had buried the truth along with his own conscience. And now that man worked at a grocery store. Now that man had watched him be humiliated again, this time in public, this time with witnesses. And Samuel wondered, was this just karma's long, bitter game? Or had something shifted? In the distance, a pair of footsteps echoed. Slow, hesitant, Samuel turned. It was Brian. No apron, no clipboard, just a man, a nervous one. He stood a few feet away, hands in his jacket, eyes darting to sidewalk. "I saw what happened," Brian said quietly. Samuel didn't answer. "I shouldn't have let it go down like that." Still silence. Brian stepped forward, voice lower now. "There's something I need to show you." He pulled out his phone and, with shaking fingers, opened a file. He turned the screen around. There it was, the old manifest, the fake route, the signature that wasn't Samuel's, and the digital timestamp showing it came from Brian's account. Samuel stared at it. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. "I was told to do it," Brian said, voice trembling. "By Carl. I was young, scared, stupid, and I've carried it every day since." Samuel finally looked up, his voice low. "Why now?" Brian swallowed hard. "Because the way he treated you today, it broke something in me." For a moment, the street went still again. Samuel stood, taller than he'd seemed all day. He took the phone, stared again at the file, then handed it back. He didn't speak. Not yet. But inside, something had cracked open. Not forgiveness. Not trust. Just the quiet possibility of justice. Later that night, the fluorescent glow of Fresh Mart dimmed as the last few customers trickled out. The store was quiet again. Only this time, it wasn't peace that lingered in the air. It was something heavier. Brian stood in the break room staring at his phone. He hadn't eaten dinner. He didn't feel like he deserved to. What he had shown Samuel earlier wasn't just a file. It was a confession. And Samuel hadn't said a word in return. Not anger. Not relief. Not forgiveness. Just silence. Brian understood that silence. It was what you gave people after they'd already lost too much for words. Meanwhile, across town in a modest but tidy office tucked between a dental clinic and an old bakery, Angela Myers reviewed documents under the soft buzz of a desk lamp. She was no stranger to injustice. Since retiring from the police force, she'd opened her own advocacy service. Quiet, underfunded, but fierce. She didn't chase headlines. She chased truth. Her phone vibrated. An email. Subject: help me do the right thing. Attached was a scanned delivery manifest. She opened it, brows knitting as she recognized the familiar signs. Falsified timestamps, a mismatched signature, digital fingerprints pointing to internal corruption. The message read, "This was used to ruin a man named Samuel Thompson. I helped cover it up. I need to make it right. Can we meet? B. Miller." Angela leaned back in her chair, eyes sharp. The name wasn't familiar, but the pattern was. She replied simply, "Tomorrow, 9 a.m., don't be late." That same night, Carl Winford sat in his living room, swirling a glass of whiskey between his fingers. He hadn't noticed Brian's mood shift. He never did. He had built his world on leverage, knowing what others didn't, holding on to secrets like currency. And in his mind, Samuel was long gone, discarded like bad press. The stunt earlier in the store had annoyed him, but not worried him. "Let them talk," he muttered. "He's a nobody." But he didn't know what had been shared. He didn't know who had seen the file. He didn't know Angela Myers had just opened the gate to his past. The next morning, Brian walked into Angela's office with his shoulders tense and his hands shaking. Angela didn't speak right away. She simply slid a legal pad across the desk. "Start from the beginning," she said. And he did, every detail. The pressure Carl had put on him, the forged document, the rerouted delivery, the silence afterward, his guilt, his fear. Angela listened without emotion. Only when he finished did she ask, "Why now?" Brian looked up, eyes red. "Because I saw the man today." And he still carried himself like someone who hadn't been broken, even after all we took from him. Angela's eyes softened just slightly. "That man," she said, "deserves his name back." By that afternoon, Angela had assembled a package. The original document, digital metadata, Brian's written statement, and a recorded confession. She'd handled enough of these cases to know that the media could be a faster weapon than the courts. She emailed the file to 3 contacts: a local investigative reporter, a regional justice coalition, and a federal veterans legal defense group. Then she made one more call, to Samuel. Samuel didn't recognize the number, but he answered anyway. The voice on the other end was calm, confident. "Mr. Thompson, my name is Angela Myers. I believe you knew the truth all along. I'm here to make sure the rest of the world does too." Samuel said nothing. Angela continued, her voice softening. "I don't want anything from you, but I have something to return." Pause. "A name they tried to take from you." Another pause. "Yours." That night, a headline made its way to the top of the local news site. "Veteran wrongfully blamed for corporate scandal finally has his name cleared." The article included Angela's summary of the case, Brian's confession, and Samuel's photo, taken years ago in uniform, smiling beside his son. It spread quietly at first, but the next morning, the world woke up, and Samuel Thompson was no longer invisible. The day the town remembered his name. Fresh Mart opened later than usual the next morning. The usual stream of early shoppers stood outside the doors, buzzing quietly, not because of a flash sale, not because of a power outage, because the face on the news, on their phones, tablets, and in the newspaper vending machine across the street, was one they had seen before and ignored. "Veteran wrongfully blamed for corporate scandal finally has his name cleared." The headline was everywhere. Some didn't believe it at first. Samuel Thompson? That man who drifted from park benches to soup kitchens? That man Carl called a problem? He had once been a decorated courier, a loyal veteran, a husband and a father, and he'd been framed? People began to talk, whisper, then speak louder. One woman clutched the article, eyes wet, I saw him carry an elderly man's groceries in the rain last winter. He always nods when he passes me, said another. Never asks for anything. Now they understood why. Samuel never begged, because he never lost his pride. It had been taken from him. Carl sat in his office, the walls closing in tighter than they ever had before. His phone buzzed nonstop. Missed calls, voicemails, messages from corporate. But the one message that froze his blood wasn't from a boss. It was a public tweet. Angela Myers had posted a thread detailing the cover-up, the forged document, Brian's statement, and Samuel's dignity through it all. The final line read, "The world forgot his name, but he never forgot who he was." Carl gripped the edge of his desk, knuckles white. He turned to Brian, who now stood calmly in the doorway. "You betrayed me," Carl snarled. "No," Brian said evenly. "I finally stopped betraying him." Meanwhile, Samuel sat on a quiet bench just outside the library. He hadn't planned on coming into town. He didn't want attention. But the truth has a way of catching up with you, even when you're not running anymore. A man passed him, then stopped. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I believe them." Samuel looked up. The man held out a fresh sandwich. "I bought two. I figured you might still like turkey." Samuel didn't answer, but he accepted it. Then came more. A nurse from a nearby clinic stopped to shake his hand. A teacher brought him a book. Jalen arrived breathless, with a local news crew trailing behind him. Samuel backed away from the cameras. "No interviews," he said. "I'm not a story." Angela arrived shortly after. She walked slowly, gave him space, then sat beside him. "You don't owe anyone anything," she said. "Not an explanation, not a performance. All of this is just the world catching up to who you've been all along." Samuel stared straight ahead, then quietly asked, "What happens to him?" "Carl," Angela smiled faintly. "He's already under federal review. Obstruction, corporate fraud, and he'll likely be stripped of his business licenses. That's just the beginning." Samuel didn't gloat. He didn't cheer. He simply nodded. And in that gesture, there was more dignity than any courtroom could ever give. Later that evening, Angela handed Samuel a manila envelope. "Inside is everything," she said. "The written apology from Vanguard, a formal clearing of your name, and your reinstated veteran benefits." Samuel stared at it. "I don't even know where I begin." "With the bread," she said softly. "Always with the bread." It was a Thursday when the loaf arrived, not from a bakery, not from a charity line, but from a boy. Jalen stood outside Samuel's small room at the community housing unit with a brown paper bag cradled in his arms. Samuel opened the door slowly, his body still stiff from sleeping on concrete for too many years. But his eyes had softened. Something had shifted in them, like fog lifting from a long-buried shoreline. "I know you said no more gifts," Jalen said, sheepishly. "But this one's different." He handed him the bag. Samuel raised a brow. "What is it?" "Bread," Jalen said, smiling, "from the bakery downtown. Still warm." Samuel stared at the bag for a long time, not because he was hungry, but because he finally realized this was full circle. He brought the loaf to the small kitchen he now shared with two other veterans. He didn't tear into it, didn't devour it. He sliced it gently. And as he took that first bite, it wasn't the bread that filled him. It was the silence around it. No judgment, no stares, no humiliation, just the sound of breathing, his own, and it was enough. Over the following weeks, Samuel slowly reintegrated into a world that had once erased him. He volunteered at the local shelter, not as a resident, but as a man with experience, patience, and time to give. He helped other men fill out forms, taught them how to navigate a system he once drowned in. Angela came by once a week, bringing newspapers and updates from the case. Carl had officially been indicted on multiple counts. Federal charges were pending, but Samuel never asked for more details, because for him, justice had already come, and not with a gavel, with a paper bag, and $5 worth of hope. One crisp morning, Angela brought a letter addressed to Samuel, handwritten, neat cursive, the kind only older hands still knew how to form. He opened it carefully. It was from Diane's sister. Samuel hadn't spoken to her since the fall. She'd read the articles, seen the video. In her letter, she wrote, "Carter turned 22 last month. He's in Ohio now, studying architecture. I showed him your photo. He didn't say anything at first, but he looked at it for a long time. Then he said, 'Tell him I never stopped waiting for him to come back.'" Tears slid down Samuel's face silently. No sobs, just release. Months later, Fresh Mart was bought out. A new name replaced the old red lettering. The new manager sent an invite for Samuel to attend their grand reopening. He declined, but he walked past it one afternoon, slowly just to see. A young boy was asking for change outside the doors. Samuel reached into his pocket, pulled out 2 crisp bills, and handed them over. The boy blinked. "You sure?" Samuel smiled. "Always start with the bread." At the end of that same week, a bench was dedicated near the city garden, a plaque carved into wood red, "For those who have forgotten but never lost," in honor of Samuel Thompson. And each week, a fresh loaf of bread was placed there by someone, never the same person twice, but always someone who remembered